Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really privileged to be joined by the president of the Illinois Senate, Senator Don Harmon. Senator Harmon is from Oak Park, just west of Chicago, grew up there, went to St. Ignatius High School, went to Knox College, as did I. He and I have been talking about that offline. The senator then went to the University of Chicago Law School and also picked up an MBA, worked for a time in Springfield as a legislative staffer, was elected to the Senate in 2002, has risen up the ranks, has had some leadership positions, chaired several committees, the executive and judiciary, and last year, in January, he was elected president of the Illinois Senate. So Senator Harmon, great to see you.
You too, John. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, let's still start at the beginning. Growing up in Oak Park, were your folks politically interested? Did they kind of pull you into the world of politics, or how did that happen?
Not directly. My dad was certainly politically curious. I remember, just watching the nightly news, or every 4 years the Democratic National Convention, and saying, "Oh, this is so boring. I can't believe he's making me watch this." But never overtly political. A big Adlai Stevenson supporter, a Kennedy fan, as an Irishman of his generation would be, but no overt politics. It turns out that family lore was that my grandfather had run for alderman on the West Side, which I always chalked up to being just that, family legend. But I just recently discovered the election results. He came in third in a field of 17 in 1931. So that's the last Harmon campaign before I ran.
Great. And were you, like, in high school, I know you went to St. Ignatius, were you politically interested, or what was that like?
No, not at all. Not at all. I was not running for student council president in the 7th grade. I really didn't get the political bug until law school, until I started studying law and recognized that the making of law was as important, if not more so, than the use of law, and certainly captured my imagination and led me to this.
Well, let's talk about your Knox days. My sources there tell me you were a stellar student, but was also involved. You played football, you wrestled, you were in a band. Tell us about your Knox years.
I love Knox. It was a great compliment to an Ignatius education. It was rigorous, but it was very entrepreneurial, as you know. And what I found is you could do almost anything you wanted at Knox if you showed up and were willing to invest the time. I played 3 sports I didn't play in high school. I don't know anyone else who has that kind of a story, and it wouldn't have been possible at a place other than a Knox. But that permeated everything. As long as you were interested and willing and did the work, you could throw yourself into almost any enterprise. And I really do feel like I had the fundamentals from Ignatius, but I became a complete person at Knox.
And were there any particular teachers who were influential in your development? And I know a few of them are probably joining us right now or watching us, so you don't have to mention all of them. But was there a class or two or a teacher or two that kind of just turned the lights on in some sense?
Well, there were so many, and you know from your own Knox experience how interactive the relationship is with faculty at such a small school. I was a double major in economics and English writing, so I was using both sides of my brain, writing poetry for half of my time and studying macroeconomics and econometrics for the other half. Roy Anderson, from my days as a prospective student until today, has been a friend and a mentor. Rich Stout was a young professor and my actual advisor through the economics program. Both had a profound impact on my academic course. Robin Metz, who recently passed away in the English department, was my protector in many ways. A football player, wrestler in the creative writing program was not a good fit, but he was a college athlete himself at Princeton, and so he always looked out for me. And believe it or not, given how my career turned out, I took only one political science course. I took constitutional law with Lane Sunderland, and that was a big spur in getting me to law school. It was not my first on my list of things to do, but that certainly set off a bulb for me.
Well, so how did U of C happen in terms of both law and MBA? Was it always the plan to combine the two, or did you start out in one and then realize you could pick up a second one at the same time?
It was in many ways just one of those fortuitous accidents. Coming through the economics program, I thought I was going to go into business or investment banking or something like that. In the mid to late 80s, everybody was getting an MBA. And somewhere along the line, someone suggested that I do a joint degree and that the law degree would distinguish me from everybody else who just had an MBA. I got a job with Arthur Andersen coming out of Knox and had that offer in hand when I was applying to the law school and business school. And I only applied to the one because it was not the top of my list of things to do. I did work for a couple of years. I deferred my admission. And ended up going back. So it was, again, just one of those fortuitous accidents where trying to find my way through a different path took me to this one, and very grateful for that.
Now, I know you worked for a time as a legislative aide in Springfield. I think you were in the House Democrats. Was it their legal shop? And was that before law school or was that at law school? And just, I guess, more broadly, how did that sort of turn on the lights in terms of state government and this kind of sense of like, hey, I wouldn't mind coming back here in a different capacity?
Yeah, it was my first year as a lawyer. This was, again, in the olden days when law firms would loan young lawyers to the House legal staff for the session on contract. So the law firm that employed me at the time signed a contract with the Speaker's office and sent me down. Actually, it wasn't the Speaker. I served in 1995, which was the first of 2 years the Democrats in the House were in the minority. That was an eye-opener. But the other thing, I talked with people who had that experience. There's something about being on staff where I knew people who had always wanted to run for office, and on their fifth day on staff said, "I am never running for office ever." I had the opposite reaction. I said I could see doing this that continued to fan the flames of my interest in pursuing public office.
So you came back to Chicago or Oak Park, and then you ran for the Senate in 2002. I think you'd done some work as a precinct man or something. So tell us about the first campaign and what was your agenda? What were you pushing? Why did you want to be elected to the state Senate in 2002?
Well, I'd gotten involved in the Democratic Party of Oak Park with Phil Rock, who had been the Senate president when I started. He was a neighbor. I had gone to grade school with his children, so knew him as a neighbor, not as the legendary statesman he is. But just walked into his office one day and said, "I'd like to recharter the Young Democrats." And he looked at me, over his glasses like he would do, and said, "All right, kid, I'll give you a shot." And so that was really just a volunteer opportunity. When I first got heavily involved on the government side was actually during the redistricting fight 20 years ago. 10 years earlier, Oak Park had been sliced up 6 ways to Sunday in the redistricting and left without a real voice. And so I led the charge locally, and we testified anytime 2 or more people were gathered to talk about redistricting anywhere in the state, whether it was the state map, the federal map, or the county map. And it did not look like it was going well. It looked like Oak Park was going to be diced up again to serve bigger interests. And then suddenly something went bump in the night, and there was a district that included most of North and Central Oak Park, as well as parts of the West Side and other suburbs like Oak Park, and an open Senate seat without an incumbent. So that's how I ended up throwing myself into that race.
Well, give us a sketch of your district. What does it look like? What kind of community is it?
It's if you're familiar with the Chicagoland area, the western suburbs, the 2 axes are really North Avenue and River Road along the Des Plaines River. So my district runs from on the east end, part of the Austin and Galewood neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. Now in the second map under which I'm serving, the most of North and Central Oak Park, north of the Eisenhower Expressway. And then out North Avenue, picking up parts of Proviso Township and Leiden Township, Melrose Park, Stone Park, Elmwood Park, River Grove, Franklin Park, North Lake, a little bit of Rosemont. O'Hare Airport is in the district that I represent. And in the latest redistricting, the district pushed much further into DuPage County. So for the first 10 years, I represented about half of Bensenville. Now I represent all of Bensenville and a good chunks of Addison and Wooddale. So an increasingly diverse district. I have an African-American representative on the east half of the district, and the west half of the district is, at least on paper, a Latino majority district. It's still maturing politically, but a very diverse district economically, socially, racially, and just a real pleasure to be able to represent it.
So you arrive in Springfield in 2003, and there's a young state senator from roughly the same areahood by the name of Barack Obama. Tell us about your first meetings with him. Did you have a chance to collaborate on issues? Tell us about that relationship.
I really enjoyed serving with Senator Obama. I knew him in passing. He taught at the University of Chicago Law School. I did not have the foresight to sign up for one of his classes, nor Elena Kagan's classes. So if I build that time machine, I'll be sure to fix those mistakes. And I had volunteered on some of his campaigns, again, at a relatively low level, but I knew him. But to go from that relationship to sitting next to him in the Judiciary Committee and, having him lean over and say, "How are you going to vote on this bill? What does it do?" That kind of a partnership was really a wonderful thing. And it was just the ride of a lifetime to support him and help him politically, both in his U.S. Senate run and then as he took over the national debate.
Did you have, I mean, you mentioned Judiciary Committee. Did you have, a handful of issues that you both were, particularly focused on and worked closely on, and so you might have had a fair amount of interaction, or?
Not precisely. I mean, it was very clear that in that 2-year period he served, he was preparing to run for the U.S. Senate and was framing issues where he was understandably going to have the marquee role. We had a lot of interaction on the Judiciary Committee on just sort of the routine things of parsing through bills and figuring out what should and shouldn't advance. But again, when I build that time machine, I'll go back and make sure to partner with him on some of the major initiatives.
When you were working with him, I mean, was there a sense like, okay, this guy might be a U.S. senator? Was that sort of the kind of realm of thinking, which would certainly be appropriate to have?
I don't think there was ever an upper limit on his talent. I think there was a clear recognition that he would be on a much larger platform. And the U.S. Senate was the obvious next step. Now, was he going to be the next Ted Kennedy and serve for 40 years in the Senate as a liberal lion? Or would he ever get that chance to make the big jump up to the White House? Not outside the scope, just a shockingly fast rise. You're a student of history. Those opportunities don't present themselves in that sort of linear fashion too often. So I wasn't surprised by the path, just by the rapidity of his ascension.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the Senate president. And you had mentioned Phil Rock. And when I started in Springfield, he was a president of the Senate. And as you say, I mean, the word statesman came to mind because he was tough as nails, smart, strategic, savvy. And I recently read his memoir, which, as you probably know, is called "Nobody Calls Just to Say Hello," which I might ask you to comment on that. But in his memoir, he said he had just a very narrow majority, as I remember, just 1 or 2 votes. And he said he was talking about his dealings with his caucus, and he said, "I did my best to tell them and teach them and show them that it's possible to be partisan and fair at the same time." And I read that, and then I read your inaugural speech just a few weeks ago where you said something kind of similar. You said, "We were sent here to solve problems. We were sent here to work together. So if your goal is to stoke anger in the hopes of burning this place down, I've got bad news for you. You will fail." Play off that. I mean, how as a leader, you have to defend the interests of Senate Democrats, but as a leader, you also have to find ways to have Republicans help out, or at least not aggressively get in the way. So tell about your formula you're developing.
Well, I have a stack of Phil's books right over here on the credenza behind me. I think I bought up every last copy to share with the caucus for the holidays. I came up short. I couldn't find 41 copies. So I'm going to have a lending library instead. But I recently just reread the book. And You encapsulated Phil's philosophy that he taught me very well. It is possible to be a staunch partisan, but still be fair. And that's what I try to take to heart every day. My job, most of all, is to be fair to members of my caucus, to advocates, to stakeholders, to members of the Senate, to the public. We need to foster a robust debate on the issues and enact policies, but not simply for partisan advantage. You start with what's the right thing to do? What is the good public policy? What is fair? And did everyone have a chance to make their voices heard? It's a judgment call every day, and we don't always get it right. But for me, if that is always the anchor, are we being fair? I can sleep at night.
Well, let's talk about this moment now, because I mean, Democrats control Springfield. I mean, you have, the governor's mansion, the House, the Senate, the constitutional officers, and as you know, this alignment of forces will not last forever. So how do you want to use this time? What do you want to make of this window of opportunity that the Democrats have now to shape public policy in Illinois?
It is a rare opportunity and one we should not squander, but it's also one where we need to recognize the limits. We have had enormous success on certain policy initiatives where it really was Democrats leading the way. Abolishing the death penalty. I just read Eric Zorn's column about the 10-year anniversary of that. That was not exclusively Democrats, but it was a huge Democratic initiative. Marriage equality, again, another one that where Democrats led the way, and we used the strength of our majority. At the same time, there are very difficult fiscal issues, which would be better solved in a truly bipartisan fashion. Again, rereading Phil Rock's book, Thompson and Edgar leading the charge on fiscal stability with Democratic legislative leaders is a model. And in my view, it was one of the greatest disappointments of the last governor's administration when Republicans controlled the mansion and what the Democrats controlled the General Assembly. There was a chance for real partnership on those incredibly difficult decisions that are best made when we all agree to jump in the pool together. Now it is really left to Democrats to try to solve those difficult fiscal issues. It is more complicated because of the single party control and the lack of bipartisan partnership. And it's also exacerbated by the national political climate where we are so polarized. And that is not good for our democracy under any configuration. And I don't care that the Democrats have control in Springfield. It is not good for Democrats to have a malfunctioning Republican Party. We are better off when we meet in the center.
In your inaugural speech, you had said the Senate has what you called an unprecedented opportunity to lead the transformation of our state. Talk about just the kind of the power configuration. I mean, you have a new speaker, Chris Welch. You have the governor. How does the Senate fit into that triangle? Do you on some issues conspicuously lead? Do you try to confer with the governor and the speaker and see how to sequence things? Talk about that relationship and particularly the role of the Senate.
I have a whole 12 months head start on Chris Welch, so it's odd at this point that I would be the second most senior legislative leader behind only Jim Durkin, who's been around for about 8 years. It's a very different world. It's also a generational shift. This is the first time all the legislative leaders are members of Generation X, or at the oldest on the cusp of the baby boom. And in my view, partnership is best. There's no reason to surprise my counterparts, Democrats or Republicans. But that said, sometimes even with fair warning, you need to push certain agenda items to the forefront, and I'm prepared to do that. I think that there will be more cooperation than one might imagine watching politics from afar. I think we all agree on what some of the problems are and what some of the solutions should be, however politically difficult they are when we all go back to our own tribes, right? How do you sell the difficult decision-making that is governing responsibly? But I am hopeful that we'll be able to solve some problems rather than admire them. and try to figure out a way to put Illinois back where it should be in the firmament of states.
Well, that's a good jumping off point. I was looking at a report by Moody's Analytics, which I think maybe was commissioned by the Illinois General Assembly. It was a report on the Illinois economy. And I want to read a couple sentences in the summary and then just have you kind of, comment on those. It reads, demographic troubles will place a speed limit on both the public and private sectors, and fiscal problems could jeopardize Illinois' ability to gracefully emerge from the recession. Excuse me. After years of population declines, Illinois lost residents at the nation's second fastest clip in 2020. Weak public finances mean Illinois will have to make extraordinary fiscal adjustments that leave it playing catch up in the next business cycle. Population loss and troubled state finances will limit Illinois' long-term potential. There's a lot to unpack there, obviously, but the two central issues seem to be the population issue, the so-called Illinois exodus, and also the budget situation, which you had alluded to. So maybe could you take those in turn? I know in terms of the Illinois exodus, you point out people have been leaving Illinois for a long, long time, since the 1920s, but the problem is they're not coming back in. So frame that issue as you see it.
Sure. And yes, it is a complicated question. I am far more optimistic than the rating agencies are on Illinois' future, and I think for good reason. There is a natural population shift that has been going on for decades. Most of that population seems to be moving to the south and southwest. I blame air conditioning for the realignment of the United States' political axes, and I think that's true. Now, the reverse is true as well. With climate change and water issues, I think that Illinois and the upper Midwest will be more attractive in the medium to long term. There's also a realignment between urban and rural, which is troubling and something of which we need to be mindful. Illinois is not unique, but certainly unusual in having one large dominant urban center in the Chicagoland area. And I think you're seeing two things. Well, when we get the census data, we'll know with more confidence, but you are seeing people moving out of rural Illinois. And you're also just as troubling seeing a migration of African-American families. And I think we need to get to the bottom of what's going on there, why people are moving, what opportunities they're pursuing. But that being said, Illinois is still what it is. We're still at the center of the country. We are a transportation hub, road, rail, water, air. From my district, you can fly nonstop to any commercial center on the globe. We are increasingly a transportation hub for data. We are, again, geographically located and a new center of data, warehouses and hubs and high-speed computing. We have world-class research laboratories and universities. There's a huge project on nanotechnology where Illinois is going to be the epicenter of that. We are still home to the world's richest agricultural land. We are still on the banks of the world's largest source of fresh water. And Chicago is a world-class city for arts and culture. There's so much going for Illinois. We have to deal with our fiscal issues, but the fiscal issue really is a century or more in the making on the unfunded pension liability. If we can get our arms around that, I think the economic and fiscal future of the state is far brighter. We have to tackle that honestly and directly and not hope for magic beans to make somebody else solve the problem for us. But I really do. I think if we can move past that budget constraint, we can find our way out of this.
I've heard people say that Illinois is one serious budget deal away from being a first-rate state again. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I do. Again, we have so much going for us, and we have suffered from politicians, not statesmen, who have just badmouthed Illinois for their own political gain when they should have been the lead cheerleaders for the state. That's one place where I will give J.B. Pritzker an unqualified A+. He is a cheerleader for Illinois, which is what a governor should do. And we need to convince the rest of the world that we are everything we know we are.
Let's talk about the fair tax issue. You had been one of the chief sponsors in the Senate. Given I've seen on YouTube some very persuasive arguments as to why this is the way the state should go. The people of Illinois decided differently in November. I guess two questions. One, why do you think they went the way they did in November? And what is plan B? You framed it that, deep spending cuts, big taxes on everyone, or a fair tax. I mean, those were really the only alternatives. Well, they said no to the fair tax. So it seems like we're facing deep spending cuts or significant tax increases for everyone.
As you said, I was a big proponent of the fair tax, and I still believe that's just an objective policy matter. It is the right answer. Most every state with an income tax has this structure. The federal government has this structure. It makes sense. It is sound tax policy. That said, the lesson I took from November is that the voters do not want a general tax increase, and that's how opponents styled this. You can't argue with that. I come back to Springfield acknowledging we're not going to be able to address this problem by simply raising taxes on everyone. So we're going to have to look at deep cuts. Now, two points. One, we are operating in a very different world than we were when the fair tax was on the ballot with the pandemic. And that has had a profound impact on how we look at this. We are doing much better than we thought we were going to be doing at the start of the pandemic, when we thought the economy was going to be, our version of the Dust Bowl and everything was going to collapse into the abyss. So we are doing much better than we expected. Not as well as we'd like, but much better. And two, especially with the recent federal action on the $1.9 trillion disaster relief bill, the federal government is finally going to give the states some tools to tackle their revenue shortfalls and hopefully try to fix some of the immediate problems and put us on a path to solving our structural problems.
The one thing that people have noted for a long time is Americans and Illinoisans just simply seem to want a level of services they don't want to pay for. Is there anything that can be done to persuade them that the size of government they want is just not sustainable given the amount of taxes they're willing to pay?
Well, here at my desk in the Capitol, I'm looking at it across the way. I have a 16 or 18-year-old cartoon under the glass facing everyone who sits across from me. It is one dog saying to another dog, I would not be opposed to a cat tax. Everybody would like to solve the problems on someone else's back. And there is no easy solution like that. It's going to require hard decision making. The only thing I can say is that you're exactly right. We have for decades and decades been providing more government services to the people of Illinois than we have asked them to pay for. And we did that by not living up to long-term obligations in a financially responsible way and pushing off the day of reckoning. Now we are staring right in the eyes of that day of reckoning. And the only alternative I can think of is to start cutting some of those government services, to figure out what tolerance people have for giving up some of those things that they assumed were always going to happen. Now, I'm not eager for cuts. I think that's the wrong way, but we need to start talking about those cuts. If we stay on this trajectory, we're not going to be able to provide these services. That's the only thing that I can think will get the attention of people to support rational tax policy.
We have a series called Meet the Mayor, where every other month we talk to a mayor of an Illinois community and try to understand what their problems are, their opportunities, and so forth. And I guess we're on our fourth or fifth mayor, and almost uniformly, when I say what causes usually the most problems, they say Springfield. And then I try to push a little bit, and it seems that means it's a code for maybe two things: the pension problem and also unfunded mandates. Do you understand their concerns, or do you think there's a little bit of kind of pointing the finger at the Capitol when they're maybe not doing things as well in their communities as they should be?
I think there are as many answers to that question as there are municipalities in the state of Illinois. We have a necessary relationship between state government and municipalities. There are things like the local government distributive fund, where the state shares its income tax revenue with municipalities. I think that's lost on most of the taxpaying public, who don't understand that a portion of their income tax actually goes to the town in which they live. And we end up with fights over how large that share should be. And when we take a difficult vote in Springfield to raise the income tax to fix state problems, the municipalities would like to have an increase for their own issues as well. Totally understandable, but it's that kind of tension that I think leads to the appearance of conflict. But again, there are as many answers to that as there are municipalities.
On the question of ethics reform, in your inaugural speech, you just said, we have to do something, and you say that you're disturbed every time a legislator leaves the building on a Friday and returns a special interest lobbyist on Monday. Is there a clear way to stop this?
I actually believe almost everybody in Springfield is here for the right reasons. They've been sent to represent the people that send them, and they do a good job. And you never read stories about, legislator works hard, goes home early. At the same time, in those handful of cases where someone retires in the middle of a session and comes back as a lobbyist, I don't know that it confers any particular advantage to that former legislator or to his or her lobbying clients, but it presents that appearance that I was the sponsor of a bill on Friday and now I'm advocating for its passage on behalf of a private client. I think a little separation there would make some sense. I don't know that it needs to be draconian or punitive. Public service is a calling, and many of us sacrifice our private sector lives to pursue it, as we should. But people should be able to go back to doing what they did, or some earning a living somehow after they retire from the General Assembly. I just think perhaps there should be a little more separation than a weekend.
Let's talk about just the challenge of legislating during a pandemic. And on the one hand, lots of problems are on your doorstep that need to be addressed. As you pointed out in one of your talks, you're the president of the Senate and you preside over a staff of 100 human beings who could get sick and make others sick. So tell us how you have balanced it over this past year. And I know you're coming back into session, I think, tomorrow. So how you see the next couple of months unfolding in terms of blending remote, in-person, et cetera.
It's certainly not the first year I expected as Senate president. I was elected on January 19th of last year, and I think it really was 2 days later the first confirmed COVID case in Illinois was documented. Within 2 months, we were canceling session and sending people home. I always try to err on the side of caution and protecting not just the members, but our staffs, Democrats and Republicans. These are real people with real families and real issues. I'm incredibly proud of the work we were able to do. We had fortuitously invested in technology ahead of time that allowed us to flip the switch fairly quickly to begin staying in touch remotely, using Zoom and other platforms that we'd never heard of before the pandemic. And we were able to come back for a very short session at the end of May of last year to pass a budget, to pass some COVID relief measures, and keep the ship running. After the George Floyd murder, we were able to successfully use our remote committee legislating process to begin having hearings with input from across the state, and to develop the Black Caucus's legislative agenda, which we passed in, again, an abbreviated session in January of this year. But we haven't been able to do much of the routine business just because we haven't been here. So we're coming back this week in a very careful way. The building is not fully opened yet. All of the members and staff that come back into the building are going to be doing the University of Illinois saliva testing that's worked so well at the University of Illinois campus bubble. We're going to maintain all the rigid requirements of mask wearing and social distancing and not lingering on the floor, but coming to vote in waves and the like. And I'm hoping that the experiment will prove successful and we'll be able to continue to take care of some of the routine business that is routine to most of the state, but critically important to the people who are advocating for its passage. And we can demonstrate that we can come back responsibly and safely.
Oh, you had mentioned the racial justice package that was passed not so long ago, and you made an interesting point in one of your talks where you kind of intimated that your children have, during this time when you've been home with them, they've been kind of nudging you. You called them, I think, burgeoning social justice warriors. What and you talk about going to Black Lives Matter events and community cleanups and so forth. Talk about, I mean, what you think was accomplished in that package, and also how it connects to you personally. What has driven you? I mean, obviously, you talked about this as being an important reason for entering politics in the first place.
Again, I am so proud of the work that our entire caucus, under the leadership of the Senate Black Caucus, did on the 4 pillars: criminal justice reform and police accountability, economic opportunity, education, and healthcare. The pandemic revealed in stark relief the structural racism inherent in so many of our systems that we may have acknowledged on the surface, but did not see so clearly before the pandemic. Things like attendance at school remotely, the number of Black and brown children who were just not showing up for virtual classes, it's like a kick in the gut. There's a real risk of a lost generation. So this is a start. This is not the end by any stretch. I don't know that we will ever finish our work, but the legislative process is one that is expressly designed for incremental change. And every once in a while, you just have to pick up the goal and move it 30 yards down the field. And that's what I think we did here. We're not done, but we changed the default position, which is one of the most difficult things to do in governing. And I know there's more work to be done. We'll come back to do that work. If there are things we didn't get right, we'll tackle those just as well. That's the beauty of the legislative process. It is a living organism, and we are always fixing and improving.
I think that was one of the points that Senator Rock made in his book too, is just the importance of incremental progress, and that you just got to keep grinding away at problems. And if you expect them to be solved quickly or expeditiously, you just are setting yourself up for deep disappointment.
Our success is measured in decades, not in single sessions.
Okay, great. We have some questions that people have emailed in, President Harmon. We received a note from Christine and Aurora, who raises the whole issue of redistricting and wants to know how the delay in census data is going to affect redistricting. And you might just play off that, the whole debate on fair maps and how you see that unfolding.
We don't know the answer to that question yet. We are trying to get our arms around it, and we understand our responsibility. Under our current constitutional construction, the General Assembly is required to perform the redistricting, and I am committed to enacting a fair map. And Speaker Welch, I think, said it most articulately: a fair map is one that reflects the diversity of our state. And I think that should be our guiding principle. We've got a lot of work ahead. It's certainly complicated by the census delay, but as is always the case, there's typically a way to get our work done.
So could you kind of explain the time frame? Because I think you're supposed to have the map by the end of June. The census data is not going to be ready till, I think some preliminary in late April. What is the time frame that you see unfolding over the next 6 months or 4 months, whatever?
Yeah, it seems to be a bit of a moving target. We still haven't even gotten the reapportionment number, which is the announcement from the Census Bureau as to how many congressional districts each state will have in the next map. So everything is clearly delayed. I'm not trying to be evasive. I wish I had a more clear answer for you. We just don't know the answer yet. We're still working our way through the options.
But this seems like an issue that particularly kind of points out the tension in President Rock's formula between being a partisan and fair, because on the one hand, your job is to draw the best maps for the Democratic Party. I mean, that's your job, but those maps may not necessarily be the fairest ones. So do you have a Rubik's Cube where you're trying to balance fairness and partisan defense?
Well, fortunately, we have direction from the federal government in particular, which has been elaborated on by the General Assembly. But the Federal Voting Rights Act lays out the first step in any legislative redistricting, and that is to make sure that minority voters have a fair chance at their choice of a candidate. And then beyond that, it is trying to make sure that communities of interest are represented in the map-making process. It is not so much a partisan issue as it is a coincidence. My view on redistricting, as much as it is on voting rights, I've always held that when more people vote, the system is better. So if we come up with a structure where more people's voices are heard, where more communities of interest are at the table, the map will not only be fair, but I am comfortable with the outcome as a partisan matter when more people vote.
Okay. Rika from Chicago raises a number of questions about just the budget and just focuses in on just the structural budget deficit and pension obligations and says, what is the formula for addressing these two related issues?
They are completely interrelated. Our pension obligations now are consuming almost a quarter of our budget, our general revenue fund budget. Senator Rob Martwick from the northwest side of Chicago has been working on this issue a great deal and recently called my attention to a phenomenon that I don't think we have fully digested. In 1995, the General Assembly adopted a 50-year plan to get the pension funds to 90% funded and put us on a pension ramp, which is the reason our annual costs have increased so dramatically. And when you look at that 50-year schedule, the ramp is quite intimidating. It peaks out in 2045 at about $19 billion a year. And then in 2046, it collapses to $2 billion a year, thereabouts, and continues on. What he called my attention to is if you look at that ramp in isolation, it is intimidating. If you extend it a century in both directions, it's absurd. So for a century before the 1995 ramp went into effect, we were putting in pennies into the system. And for the 100 years after we're completed with the ramp, we will essentially be doing the same. So there's an honest question of generational equity here. We are essentially asking one generation of taxpayers to solve this problem by itself. It is my working lifespan. It is my children's biological life until they're in their mid 40s. It does not make any sense. And if you were a private, you would say we are doing it wrong. And there is no equity in doing this. I think we need to look at that. This has been talked about as re-amortizing the pension debt. And there's always been a resistance to doing that because critics would argue it is kicking the can down the road. I would say that not kicking the can down the road has put us in this position where 25 cents of every tax dollar is going into the pensions at the expense of schools and economic opportunities. I think we need to rethink the generational equity. And if we're putting in 15 cents of every dollar instead of 25 cents and using the remainder to fund schools and businesses and the services that people rely on, that's a pretty solid argument in favor of restructuring this obligation.
And you've argued that you think the 2010 pension bill, which created the Tier 2 system, is going to yield long-term benefits. I mean, that it's a more substantial reform than is oftentimes acknowledged. Is that fair?
Without a doubt. I don't know that it was even acknowledged at all. It's the most significant pension reform ever in Illinois, possibly in the country. I think the pension obligations are about $250 billion less than they would be because of that reform. And there's a natural transition period. Every public employee in the state hired after December 31st of 2010 is in this new pension system, which is far more measured and digestible. But we still have a generation of Tier 1 pensioners who need to work their way through the system. We have a moral obligation as well as a legal one to fund those commitments. But it's going to take some time. I don't think anyone is assigning any credit for that transformation, which I think we don't measure success in years, you measure them in decades. And when we look back on that, that will be the most significant thing we did on pensions.
Betsy from Springfield asked about higher education funding in the new budget. She's actually, I think, a grad of Carbondale, but just wants to know what lies ahead for higher education given these challenging fiscal times?
It is an embarrassment to the state what we have done for higher ed funding over the last several decades. It is a cutting off your nose to spite your face model. I hope that at least for now, we can aim for level funding and in the long run to start to reinvest in our commitment to higher ed. The percentage funding in real dollar terms rather than nominal terms is just embarrassing. I think we're less than 50% of where we were 25 years ago. And the higher ed system is one of Illinois' absolute competitive advantages. So we should be investing more. At the same time, just like we do in every other area of state government, we're going to have to ask the institutions to be responsible and to make sure that the money is getting into the classroom and to the research that we expect it to get to. You and I coming from Knox College, a small liberal arts college where the most tenured faculty were teaching the introductory classes often. That's a model that I certainly worked for me, and I'm grateful for that. I think we need to look at higher ed across the state and try to make sure that the focus is always on the student and the research and the academic work, and that we're getting the right bang for our buck.
Carl from Edwardsville asked about your agenda on the labor front. What labor legislation do you envision coming up in the next period of time?
I am very committed to the rights of working men and women, and I think that we always want to make sure that people have a right to bargain collectively. There's certainly been talk over the last several years about the quote-unquote right to work, and we have, I think, successfully described Illinois as a place where the right to organize is preeminent. Mostly, I want to put people to work. I think that's whether you're in a labor union or not, a good job solves an awful lot of problems. We passed a capital bill a year and a half ago now, and we have not, because of the pandemic, we have not seen that come to fruition as aggressively as I would hope. I think we need to double down on that and start finding ways to put people to work. I think there's a real opportunity in the energy sector as Illinois continues to transform to an epicenter of green jobs and clean energy, to make sure that those are good, high-paying jobs that can't be outsourced. You can't build a solar farm or a transmission line in Illinois by outsourcing it to another country. That's work that's going to happen here. And those are good jobs that provide for families. So I think we want us to encourage that kind of investment too.
Sabrina from Carbondale asks what sort of health-related legislation you see coming up in this session.
The one pillar of the Black Caucus legislative agenda that did not pass, and it was not for a failure of substance, it was just a procedural hiccup in the waning minutes of the last General Assembly, really focuses on the equity issues and the healthcare availability. In the Senate, we have long had a Health and Human Services Committee, this year rebranded as the Health Committee. I also created two new committees, one on healthcare access and availability, and one on behavioral and mental health. I think those committees are going to be very active. Mental health parity, well, nominally the law certainly still has a ways to go in practice. Senator Laura Fine has taken up the chair of that committee and is already scheduling a whole host of subject matter hearings to try to call attention to some of our shortcomings. And then Senator Patricia Van Pelt, the chair of the Healthcare Access and Availability Committee, will continue, I think, working on those issues identified by the Black Caucus of disparities in our healthcare system based on race and zip code. Senator Julie Morrison is, again, the chair of the Health Committee, another Knox grad, I will point out, and will preside over all of those difficult conversations about how we spend our healthcare dollars.
Let's talk for a few minutes about your leadership style and how you bring your caucus together. And I was struck by looking at Senator Rock's book. He had, I think, just a very narrow majority, and there were some very distinct factions. And he said that his overarching goal was to have as few caucus meetings as possible because nothing good could come from those. And he thought it made much more sense to deal with legislators in kind of small groups, one-on-one, and so forth. you have a little bit larger majority, but how does it play out? I mean, is your caucus as distinctly divisible as the caucus he described?
I don't envy Phil his challenges. He used to joke every morning in Springfield, he'd look in the mirror and have to decide whether to shave his face or slit his throat. He was always dealing with a renegade faction. We have a remarkably cohesive caucus, albeit one that is built on these various different caucuses. We have a large and growing Black caucus that has really come to the political fore in the last year and done remarkable work. The Latino caucus is the largest it has ever been and is maturing politically and doing great work, both in supporting the Black caucus agenda and in making sure that the Latina Latinx community was not forgotten in that conversation. The Women's Caucus in the Senate is growing and working in a bipartisan fashion on critical issues. We have an Asian caucus. We have our first Asian American senator, Senator Ram Vilivalam, who has reached out to all the members with large Asian American populations in their districts and is working with other Asian American leaders across the state. We have a new progressive caucus. We have an informal caucus of more moderate members. And I meet with all of them. And we caucus regularly. In Springfield, we typically caucus once a week. But even in our time away, because of Zoom, I was caucusing with the entire caucus at least every couple of weeks to keep everyone informed. And I found that, unlike Phil's time, that communication and inclusion builds cohesiveness and allowed us to rally when it came time to actually come down to Springfield to cast difficult votes. We had a retreat over the summer that forced us to look into the face of some of these issues of racial injustice in a way that I don't think many of us had to do. And it was transformative to hear caucus members, elected senators talk about their own personal interactions with police officers, as an example. It was stunning that someone with legislative license plates would find themselves with their hands on the hood of a car. It makes no sense to most of us, but it's the life that members of my caucus were living. So to be able to have that conversation honestly and to develop legislation out of it, I think our caucus is more cohesive than it's ever been.
In terms of your week, I mean, COVID obviously changed everything, but once COVID eases, what would be a typical week in your life? Would you be, down in Springfield, like during session, say, Monday evening till Thursday evening, or how do you structure your time between home, your district, and in Springfield?
In session, I would typically come down Monday morning, even when I was in the leadership team and not Senate president, because there's a lot of work to do to get ready for session. We do bill review, we prepare for committees, we do a lot of legwork before the show starts, if you will. And then so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are our traditional session days, a lot of committee work early on in the session, more floor action later in the session. And then try to get back to the district for meetings on Friday and Saturday, sometimes on Sunday before doing it all over again. COVID's been obviously very different. We went months without coming to Springfield. One of the very little silver linings to a pandemic, but the amount of time I've been able to spend with my high school age daughters has been really rewarding. And even my daughters admit this. So I don't know that we will ever have that sort of time together again. So I try to treasure that. My oldest is away at college, but not too far. And so being able to keep in touch with him and suffer through this all together. I expect they'll be talking about it in 40 or 50 years, the year without school or whatever it will be described as. But I know my caucus is looking forward to getting back to Springfield to do something that looks and feels normal. And I can only hope that that will start soon.
Well, you were saying, I think in one of your talks that you were describing battling with your kids for the Wi-Fi and having to kind of crawl down on the floor and unplug and plug the modem and some of the things that maybe the president of the Senate is not oftentimes pictured doing to just keep the ship going.
no man is a prophet in his hometown, and certainly my family keeps me well grounded. Dad, take out the garbage. Dad, can you reset the modem? And look, that's what makes us all better legislators, is the fact that we really are citizen legislators. We are not living these exalted lives. I drive myself places. It's not like it is in the movies, or like it might really be for the president or senior U.S. senators. I get lobbied at the grocery store. I've been lobbied at mass. It's we're a part of the fabric of the community, and that makes us better at the jobs that we try to do down here in Springfield.
And you had said also that your children during this time, and you have had kind of maybe deeper conversations about just how they see the world, racial justice issues and so forth. I mean, talk a little bit about how that's, sort of shaped your thinking.
They really are committed to social justice in ways that are incredibly pleasing to me as a father, but also challenging as a political person. If I can't convince my kids of a policy initiative, I don't know how lucky I'm going to be convincing the rest of the world. And they're hard judges, but they are also very astute. And we had a one talk I remember with two of the kids. There had been some protesting in Oak Park and some disruptive protesting at the mayor's house. And I'd made the point that I didn't know that was terribly productive in convincing people to listen to the views of the protesters. And my kid said, "Dad, you don't get to make the rules for how people protest." And that sunk in. I may have a view on what's effective or not effective, but that's my view as a middle-aged white guy with a fancy title. And they really did make me think twice about how I judge other people and the implicit biases I have in just judging the effectiveness of protest. And I try to remind myself of that even when they're not here to poke me in the nose and tell me I'm doing it wrong.
Well, Senator, I think if we were doing this interview from your home office, there'd be two guitars in the background.
There's one here.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, well, let's tell us a little bit about your musical aptitude. I've heard it's considerable. You're part of a band, and is it a bipartisan band that does some events? Tell us about that.
Musical aptitude may or may not be the right qualifier. It's more sheer force of will. I started playing guitar early in high school. I just wanted to do it, and I did not have a particular aptitude. I think my high school band didn't even plug in my microphone for fear I might actually sing. But I kept doing it. I played in a band in college at Knox and had a great time doing that. Some of the best friendships I've ever had. Picked it up again in law school with a law school band, and then kind of just let it sit. I never stopped playing guitar, but I wasn't playing in bands until my son got the bug at 8 or 9, and we started taking some lessons together. And I said, "Oh, that's what I was supposed to have learned 30 years ago. Now it makes sense." And it started innocently enough. We reconstituted the high school band for a fundraiser out at Fitzgerald's in Berwyn, in South Oak Park. And it went from there. So we've been doing that event every year, and the local band, which the lead singer from the high school band has survived. Other than that, we've populated it with local ringers, which is good. It's like real estate, the worst house on the best block. But then in Springfield, there were two Republican state reps who grabbed their guitars and went to a dive bar here and started playing, and they invited me to come out for the second performance. And we would have given a lot more thought to our name and our repertoire had we realized it would take on the legs that it did. But we've ended up playing in music festivals across the state and all sorts of Springfield gigs. We opened up for Buddy Guy and Toby Keith at the pinnacle of Bruce Rauner's time in office at his inauguration. And it's been great fun. And it has had this weird bipartisan effect where when members and staff of both parties come to a bar to sing along and play and do what they're going to do, everybody drops the partisan labels.
Great. Well, Senator, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to catch you when COVID allows, maybe to come down to Carbondale, meet with students and the community, and you can bring your band along too, and maybe we can arrange, see if we can fill up the arena for you there.
Oh my gosh. Somebody told me I should quit the Senate and go on the road. I said, absolutely not. The only reason anyone comes to see us is because we have fancy titles. So we know our place. But my two colleagues have retired and moved on, but we'll find a way to continue the music.
Great. Well, and we would love to host you down here. I know you like to get around the state as best you can. So when conditions allow, we'd love to see you down in Carbondale.
I'll look forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have a YouTube clip of this interview on our website in the next day or two. So please look at it, show it to your friends and family, and get it out in circulation. And thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.